Get that with you away. So is this working? Everyone can hear me? I mean, it's not that big a room, but I'm guessing people online will need to use this. Cool, fine. My name is Lisa, nice to meet you all. I'm a technology at the Welcome Trust. I'm going to stand for this bit and I'm going to sit, mostly because I'm 32 weeks pregnant and standing for like 5 minutes is just not happening these days. Aims of this session, I think hopefully should have been shared as part of the like conference agenda, etc. But I'm going to go over them, and they are quite clearly and quite high level, just because we're in this really exploratory stage of work at the Welcome Trust. So I want to share a little bit about some of the work that the online audio is not too great. If I speak louder, is that better, or do I need to move a bit distant? Maybe closer to the laptop?
Should be that mic.
It should be that mic. So there was a problem with one of the microphones last time we were in here, so let's see if this other one works. I'll try this one and see if that's any better. Keep talking about that one.
Okay, sorry, we're working on the tech of that. We'll try and speak as loud as I can. Where was I? Yeah, so I want to share a little bit of some of the work that we've been doing at the Welcome Trust, which take about 10 minutes. Sort of exploring the kind of needs of scientific software developers, and we'll talk a bit about what I mean by that. Then really keen to throw it over to you guys to hear a little bit more about your experience and your needs, and then discussing some of the ways that we can design and deliver funders programs to responsive to sustainable software development. We have had some things come out of our work and different findings that we can use as a jumping off point, but really happy to have it as a very open discussion. So this is like a big program of work that we kicked off in sort of the last month or so. So we're doing some kind of expert interviews, we're meeting with people, software developers across institutions, both here in the UK as well as the US, and particularly the African continent, since we're doing a lot of our work at the minute. Meeting with different community leaders and collaboratives, and also working with other funders. So particularly with CWI, we've just done a big program of work with, as well as linking in with other funders across the world really, but mostly across the US. And we're doing these workshops. We've got this one here today, as well as some internally at Welcome, and a few others like at RSCCon and a few other kind of big meetings that I'm sure you're all familiar with coming up in the next 6 months, as well as bringing some of these internationally. So we've got some meetings in the US with CZI and their team in June, and then we've also got some in Nairobi in June as well.
Try this other microphone there.
Okay, so everyone online, we're trying a new microphone, which hopefully is paired better to the Zoom call. If that's not any better, do shout and we'll try something else. Cool. So the purpose of doing all of this is creating a report. Funders love to create reports, and a bit of a briefing paper to outline an options appraisal for us on how we need to do our funding differently and better, and also how we're going to work more closely with other funders and advice for them. So those are within the UK. You'll probably know quite a lot of them, like the Research Software Alliance, so people like Kraken, UKRI, as well as those kind of other big international funders that I mentioned. And really trying to make sure that we're not just creating something lovely on paper, something that we're using for ourselves, but something that hopefully will help to drive change more broadly. So our definition of this, and I know that it might not be relevant for all of you guys, I'm obviously happy to hear from everyone's experience across the main, so you're very clear, but what we're focusing on is this source code files, algorithms, scripts, workflows, exercises, everything that's either created as a byproduct of research, maybe to do that research, or that actually might be developed for general use by one or more projects. Audio is money. Our captions, sorry, are being enabled. Apologies. I don't know.
Yeah.
They are. Fine. Just checking. Excellent. Just making sure it wasn't a question. Yeah, so anything that's created within a research project maybe is a byproduct of that, and we realise actually, hang on, this is something which can be turned into a piece of software, or which may, there's a primary and secondary intention, be developed as a research project itself. So we've done a few different pieces of work that have both sort of generated and conceptualized a lot of early thinking for us, as well as some that have been more targeted to try and take that early thinking forward. So we've been doing a piece of work looking at scientific software usability. So myself and one of my colleagues have met with development teams who've created tools, workflows, big platforms like the Human Cell Atlas and OpenSafely, sort of looking at all kinds of different scales, to try and see how they have developed their software, how they started to think about users' usability and testing through that, what support and skills they have for that, and basically how they had integrated a product management approach to their development. Essential open source software, which I think some of you are already familiar with, certainly from what I've been hearing. This was a CTI initiative. We collaborated with them most recently in their cycle 6 of funding. So this is looking at open source software for life sciences. I'll talk slightly about that in a minute. Another piece of what we've been doing is looking at sort of computation approaches to bias mitigation. So we're thinking a lot about AI benchmarking, we're thinking a lot about ethical AI. But what we're hearing is that lots of tools and libraries out there, unless they're funded by IBM and supported by them, are depreciating. They're not necessarily user friendly. They're not being quality assured as often. We're sort of thinking about what's already out there that we need to be supporting and funding in that space. We're doing a lot of work, like I said, across the African continent, particularly looking at transfer learning and advanced AI and analytical capabilities. So we're creating lots of open source platforms and repositories, and we're kind of in this quite interesting space of the ethics of democratization of access to these tools and software. And sort of thinking about, well, yes, we're doing capacity building, and yes, we're creating all these beautiful things for people to use, but are they actually going to be able to use them safely and effectively? And that's what led us into our last piece, which is responsible handover. So that's really focused on like the non-coding elements. So how do we support communities of contributors? Why do we support good governance of software? How do we make sure that documentation and things like that are supported throughout, rather than having what we have been finding is that people find that they're kind of funding only goes up right into the point of deployment and then not beyond that. So just a little bit to delineate between some of the kind of two camps, the two ways we've been thinking about our funding. So we've got this essential piece. So I'm sure you've all seen that diagram of like lots of blocks stacked up, and there's one tiny one of some guy in Nebraska, and that kind of stuff is obviously really important. That's what I think a lot of what EOSS is trying to support. So we had lots of people from NumPy and scikit-learn and lots of kind of really core building blocks of software development apply for funding through that, which was fantastic. But what we had thought we would see within that funding program is a lot of people reach out for things like community support and contributions. We thought we'd see a lot of people wanting support with documentation and other non-coding elements. We thought we'd see a lot of EDI focus. There wasn't a huge amount of that come through in the applications. We sort of saw sustainability being interpreted in different ways. Lots of people wanted to make things more user-friendly, which was great, but there's lots of people applying with like, I want to sort of expand my capabilities. And while none of that was bad, we sort of felt like personally, like as a funder, what we've gone in to do, we kind of missed the mark, which is looking at that kind of more holistic support rather than just funding more coding development. And it also was only focused on biomedical research, which is a small part of our portfolio. And we really felt like there were all these really great people doing amazing stuff coming to us and saying, yeah, but can I have money too, please? So that was quite an interesting learning experience for us. And I think it was really great to work with CDR, very experienced in this space. But now we're thinking, do we do more of this or do we do something else, and what does that look like? Which is part of what's led us to being here today, I suppose, and doing all this other work. And then some of the software pieces that we're funding are like very specific tools and technologies that have been developed through Wellcome Research, or Wellcome Funded Research, I should say. So this is one, for example, a tool as part of our mental health data prize, which is basically just, we'll get into all the specifics, and especially mental health researchers, it might sound like a lot, but essentially counterfactual analysis that isolate active ingredients for mental health research. What we find in this project, when we kind of went back and spoke to them, the Alliance team, was that they weren't really pro to think about things like documentation from the start. These were not people with like a heavy software background. They were mental health researchers predominantly. And they really felt like they'd had lots of support through their funding process, but no one had sort of started to think with them about what a product could look like if that's what they were going to develop. And actually doing that really early on would be really helpful. Because a lot of the burden was on them as researchers to be thinking about this stuff, to think about the regulations, to think about ethics, etc. And they weren't really equipped to do that, or certainly weren't equipped by us. And the grant wasn't long enough to help them disseminate that tool and understand what documentation had to look like and to iterate on that. They kind of felt like it felt like a really hard brick wall at the end. They also did flag that all these requirements should come with a pinch of salt, and then we shouldn't necessarily be like creating really heavy grant conditions, and we need to have that flexibility that allowed them to develop what they need to develop without feeling like really under pressure, because they're already trying to do so much in a short period of time. So those were just like two of our kind of big projects recently. So one funding that kind of essential piece, and then one looking at specific tools that we were supporting. And there were, oh, sorry. couple of key areas of focus for us. So one was then thinking about what I was like finding, sorry, from working with these. So one was looking at like the focus of our funding. I guess it's unsurprising to anyone here, but commonly we're funding that cliff edge innovation. We're not funding maintenance activities. People saying that like what they maybe needed was to have space to come back and get refunded or get further support as they realize. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry about the audio. I'm not really sure how to fix that, Cass. Apologies. Yeah, they weren't getting any support to come back and say actually this could be a piece of software or that we need more support with this, and that instead they were only getting support if it was doing something really cool and innovative. And so we needed to think about what we were prioritizing funding being available for. Kind of skills to priorities. So we had lots of research teams tell us that they had like a real variation, whether there was a product manager, an RSE, user design expert available to them. They often didn't understand what they might need those roles for, and if they did, that they hadn't costed appropriately for their time, or the organization would give them so much time, and then again, there was like a really hard stuff on that. And they weren't often carrying out like market analysis or sort of looking what else was out there that they could iterate on. They were often doing things right from scratch, and not realizing until like down the line that it was being duplicative. And there was also then this kind of real messy interpretation of open source software principles, which we found really interesting, particularly when it came to artificial intelligence development. We really felt like people needed more guidance on how they actually might apply open source principles to AI release. When we actually were giving people money, even if it was for the right thing, they often weren't given sort of the right guidance to say that they could get these additional skills. I was telling them in a session earlier that we sometimes come up against these quite interesting institutional issues and charity law issues around whether or not we're able to give people money for things like product managers, because it's kind of moving into this commercialization space, and that's against like IP for good. And so really how we kind of design our funding schemes that allow them to access those skills is quite complex. As well as adding in those non-coding activities to their timeframes. And quite importantly is that we need, or at least we're hearing from people, that we need to be influencing institutions, particularly academic institutions, so that software scenes develop these are like the RSEs are given those career pathways and progression, because otherwise we were finding that even if we were giving funding for these things to happen, they weren't being prioritized by research teams because that wasn't what they were going to get credit for, or there weren't RSEs available because it wasn't sort of fitting in with their kind of own career progression. And lastly, was on sort of user experience and contributor experience. So the thing that we've been hearing so far, maybe you're going to tell me something differently today, is that finding support for community wrangling was often some of the most difficult, that lots of our sort of software developers we've spoken to were struggling with, that they couldn't get support for things like convening communities and having like good governance processes. Did we even really know what good governance might look like for them? So that was really interesting, and how we kind of do that sustainably, because again, one-off funding to support a community is not going to be something that's going to engender continued participation. So how can we kickstart that, or how can we intervene at a certain point, and then allow that to kind of continue itself sustainably with other funding or other models, is a really big question for us at the minute. I think in general, we're just finding this was another piece of work that someone was doing, and like the wider welcome team, unfortunately, she couldn't actually make it today. She's unwell, to help speak to it. But I think again, it was just kind of like driving home that point that there's like really poor funding provision for translation. There's lots of research being done, and that again, people are seeing translation as a step, when actually it's this kind of iterative cycle. Sorry, please stop this.
Well, is there something wrong with the video? I've got text and yeah,
No, sorry.
There's nothing, yeah, the video isn't coming through, and the sound is not as good. Is that we're on the wrong thing?
could you try the microphone again?
Yep. Is that any better?
Leo is better.
Okay, that's one thing.
No, it's different. It was different setting.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, that's what reminded me.
I guess it depends on how much the online people want to see the room. They can see the slides currently. So maybe we should,
Someone did say that they've dropped out because a combination of that audio and not being able to see is making it a difficult problem.
I hope the audio is fixed.
Is that audio any better, even if you can't see, or you can only see a frozen screen?
Yeah, what you just said was better, much better.
I kind of feel bad for stopping you mid-presentation. I feel maybe we should get through the presentation and then worry about the camera afterwards.
Certainly, I can turn my camera on after I've presented, if that's.
Yeah, so should we finish off the presentation and then stick around and take a shot with the camera once we get to the
Yeah, when do you finish?
Just in the next couple of
Okay.
minutes. Yeah. What were we talking about? Yes. Okay. So we're starting to try and think more about what sustainable open source looks like for us. So yeah, of course, there's the kind of funding part, but again, it's coming back to the community, to the governance, to the capabilities. And I think we really don't have a good idea for us as a funder of what good software health needs to look like, what we need to prioritize both when we're funding things and saying this is what we need you to get to show us that you've got healthy software, but also what we prioritize when we're assessing applications from people. And I don't know that there's necessarily a black and white fixed answer to that, but I think what we're trying to do is generate more insight for ourselves and for the other funders that we work with to help determine some of those things. And obviously leaning heavily on groups like Chaos and that do this really well. So just kind of wrapping up some of those findings, appreciate that was a real whistle stop tour, but I'm quite keen to just hear from you guys, your thoughts. So we're going to get on to discussion in the next slide. But some of the things that people have suggested us that we might do, so I thought I'd share as sort of like a bit of a starter for 10. So of course, it's that prioritization of funding, so direct provision of funding for maintenance activities, better accounting of deployment needs of software, funding cohorts, so not just giving people money, but giving them support, giving them access to each other, to open source experts, to development experts, to some of the regulatory pathways, whatever it might be, depending on kind of the specifics of their work. And these blended funding models, which I'd say is probably the most controversial ones, which is either facilitating or allowing partnerships with industry and allowing their expertise, their funding networks to be leveraged as well. And then the recognition of software as a research output has come up again and again. I noticed it was one of the discussion points this morning. I think one of my colleagues went along to that. But making sure that people can get credit for their work, particularly within their institutions. I think I personally had thought this was much more of an external ecosystem issue. But actually, the more I talk to people, the more I'm hearing, no, I need my university to give me that credit. So I've got two kind of questions for discussion. Before I show those magically, is there any burning questions or like clarities on that? I appreciate it was quite quick and people online maybe didn't get all of it. So if there's anything you want me to clarify first, I'm really happy to do that. Oh, sorry. Please.
Will these slides be available online? Are these slides linked somewhere? There was a lot of information in there. Amazing. Thank you.
Recording should happen.
Just so that people online. This recording's it will be available too, so you'll be able to see that as well. Can I ask a question as well? What are you doing on the recognition of software as a research output? If you actually, I mean, I see that's a goal currently. Has anything happened to shift it towards achieving that goal?
No. There's the short answer. The kind of reason being, I mean, when I say kicked off, like in the last sort of 4 to 6 weeks, we've been doing a lot of this work. Obviously, we've got a lot more going on. I'm around for about 7 more weeks, and to kind of create this report, this options appraisal, and then within that there'll be the kind of actions for Welcome to Take. There's a big funders meeting in September that my colleagues, obviously not myself, will be taking a lot of this work to as well, to discuss some of those funder-wide policies and actions that we might want to take, as well as then us thinking about what we need to maybe do as like pilot or proof of concept versus change to our grant conditions. So there's like lots of different pathways of implementation for this. Sorry, that sounds really vague. And I promise I'm not just here to like extract all your information and run away and never do anything with it. But yeah, I guess we just don't know where those levers are. And is it changing how our grant conditions are. Is it some of our big partnerships when we give money directly to an institution? Obviously much easier for us to say, well, you have to do X, Y, and Z differently. You know, we're already looking, we fund places like Sanger, etc., and thinking about, well, how do we give funding in like blocks for some of that support rather than just going in for like a specific resource or a specific project. But all of it's still quite exploratory. Anything else for me, or all the stuff I just threw at you? Oh yeah, how do I? Oh yeah, you can just unmute and ask if you.
Okay. I want to make sure the to not just talk over anybody. But a question I have is, what other organizations or funders are you like talking or not collaborating, but at least having these conversations with? Because I know often within this space, there might be, a group of people talking to one another, but this is a problem that isn't just in this space, but in many open source communities. So I'd be interested to hear who is involved and see whether there's additional suggestions that might be possible.
Yeah, very happy. I mean, very happy to take suggestions of other developers and teams we should speak to, of software engineers we should speak to, community groups we should speak to, and funders. So please do feel free to shout those out. Obviously, we work very closely with CZI because we've just done the EOSS project with them. They're running a big convening in June that some of my colleagues are going to be attending as well. The others, it's hard because it's very much just about kind of us bringing to them and sort of gently suggesting, and this is what we're doing and what do you think? So my colleague Hannah, who's here at the wider meeting but not in the room right now, sits on the Research Software Alliance Funders Forum. So obviously we'll be having discussions with them and bringing stuff to them. They're obviously all very engaged in this too. So I mean, I could start to list out lots of people, but I don't know how useful that is, and they're kind of all variations of engagement. But unsurprisingly, I suppose for a lot of people here, CZI are the people that are most interested in this, and we're hoping to bring some of the others along with us, like Gates and Bloomberg in particular. So I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment. Oh, cool. Thank you for the suggestions. Right, I'll just share then our discussion questions, and I might also sit down if that's okay. So the first one was a response to these findings, if you can call them that. Like I said, this has been a pretty rapid piece of work. But yeah, how has funding been responsive to your needs, if at all? And then in particular thinking about, is there like a risk to your software sustainability, assuming that you've all are developing or might develop software, apologies. Yeah, if we were to not change anything and kind of keep doing things how we're doing.
Yeah, Simon's getting his step count in. Hello, my name is Sarah Gibson. I'm a core maintainer for the Jupyter Hub project. And you had a lot of examples of funders there. And the thing that makes me itch is that they're all kind of linked to domains. Like it was like funding for life sciences. Jupyter Hub and Project Jupyter more broadly are not domain specific. And whether it's life science or volcanology or climate science or astrophysics, people will be using Jupyter. And there is no funding that doesn't have that stipulation of, oh, you must be supporting this kind of science or that kind of science. And that just puts the onus on us to like write up a use case. And like, we can do it, but also we're doing this in our nights and weekends and we don't want to. And like, I think it's fairly obvious at this point that Jupyter is a pretty critical piece of open source infrastructure in science. But I also recognize that a funder just being like, here's some money is a difficult situation to be in. But like, and I don't know whether it's like a new funder spinning up that's going to be like a bit more science neutral, or maybe like the current funders getting together as a consortium and being like, okay, here's a percentage from each like domain non-specific funding. And I think as well, like in Jupyter Hub, we just need money for maintenance and keeping the lights on. because it takes time and effort to respond to security patches and pushing out the next release. We're not even talking about code development, you know, community expansion at the minute, like just keeping the lights on. Like everybody in Jupyter Hub has another job, right? So like any pot of money where we can buy someone out of their job and give them a stable income to just have the uninterrupted brain cycles to do whatever it is that needs to be doing, whether that is maintenance or strategic thinking about community and such, like it's already a great help. We did receive one of the CZI EOS grants that put me in a position as a community strategic lead. And like, yeah, what we discovered from that was that like you need the dedicated brain cycles of a human being, and like you need like the support networks as well. I think there was probably some mistakes on our end that also made that grant not work out as well. But like, yeah, I just think there's like really great value in having enough cash to hire someone full time to think about whatever needs thinking. So those are some of my thoughts.
Respond there, or do you want? I'm going to see if that other microphone's working.
No, I very much hear you in that, and I think this is an interesting piece of work that we were literally reflecting last week. We think we need to do is looking at when people. So, for example, we've had this big call recently on mental health digital interventions, and everyone wants to develop like a model and/or an app, mostly both, which has its own issues. But actually, we were saying we need to go through, and there's like quite literally hundreds of applications, and pick out what they're using to do that, and then go to those people and say, well, how do we fund and support you? And I think you're right. I think some of that needs to come from us. Some of it needs. It's hard as a funder. That sounds very dramatic. We don't have much that's actually that hard. But what can be quite difficult is making the case when you've got these big strategic aims around, for us, like health and science focus, of saying like, but what's that? And this is what my team's trying to do, is that like cross-cutting foundational piece that keeps, and I kind of hate that diagram, that comic with the guy in Nebraska, but it's the one I use consistently because I think it really gets across. Actually, you can talk my ear off about this really cool genomics workflow, but so much of it is reliant on like this one thing, and you're doing nothing for that one thing. And I think it can be a difficult sell, but we're trying to like gather all that data and get that. But I feel you that I don't know that any funder is ever going to move truly away from having a specific science or whatever focus. But yeah, maybe a new collaborative is the way to go. That's really helpful.
Okay. Yeah, we're up. So can the people online see us okay now on the room video? Show of thumbs, brilliant. Yeah, that worked. And this microphone's working. What turned out to be the problem is you have to hold it vertically to get it to turn on and pair. See, I was this doesn't work, but like that works. So there we are. So you can keep that microphone now, and yeah, it's just a loose connection, so you just have to be very careful. Okay, so we've got a second microphone. Who would? Any other comments, Dave?
Lisa, we haven't met in person yet, but we have spoken a few times recently about RSECon.
Good. Oh, yes.
I just had some comments to start the discussion around sustainability, I guess. So in terms of sustaining software into the future, there's the obvious aspects of kind of maintaining code after a project is finished. But I think there's some other areas that don't get talked about much. So most of the time with software, you're consuming data, and the cost of storing that data is not always accounted for. And then also kind of the development of APIs that will wrap that data so it can be consumed not just by your software, but by software generally, like in this ecosystem of tools, is really valuable. And then that kind of underlying really critical work around data format development, so that as new technologies come in, they will emerge, and the data formats will always be supported. So there has to be this ongoing work to kind of, harmonize data formats that serve the needs of the software that's being developed and can be maintained. And then, there's kind of middleware within the software that can be easily injected for ongoing support as new technologies evolve. So a couple of points there.
I think one of the biggest issues we face in terms of making our software sustainable and manageable long term is that we rarely get enough funding to cover the actual writing of the software, let alone do any documentation or actually realistically making the software pretty good. A lot of the time it is a case of get it out quickly. And I don't know if that's purely a problem because of how our PIs work, or if it's because that isn't, like documentation isn't required by funders and stuff.
Can I ask, do you think the issue is more time or more money or a different prioritization? Because I think, and again, this is not suggesting nefarious activity on anyone's part, is that sometimes what we get costed in a budget and then what we find out has actually been spent and done is slightly different. Because, and again, I totally get it. Like, I've worked in academia, like I know that sometimes it's easier to call something one thing when actually it's maybe slightly going to something else. And is it this fear that you're not going to get supported if you are costing for an RSC's time because you think that we or someone else won't know what that is? Or is it just that the pots aren't big enough and the time you're given isn't long enough or something else? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, but for us, we, like, I in my institute have the issue that I don't get written into grants. I get asked to do the work after. Right. But in the few grants where I have been written in, the amount of time that we're allocated, because the funding pot is limited, like if the funding pot was bigger, they could in theory ask for more time for me, or at least I could argue, you're getting more money now, give me more time to actually do the thing. I don't think I've ever only spent the amount of time that I've been allocated to do a job. You've just got to make it up in other ways so the software gets written.
That's fair. Thank you.
Just following on for that, the way RSCs sometimes get funded seems to have a few different models. That sometimes RSCs seem to get funded as researchers, sometimes as technicians, and that affects the amount of overheads that come through. I had a call recently where we were funded on a capital call, so we're essentially equipment. I think that actually attracted overheads. But one problem with that grant actually is there was absolutely no travel money or anything else. So we can't buy hardware, we can't travel, and we've got a very distributed project. So it's not just the time, it's actually having some travel could be useful too.
I'm going to take the opportunity to say a couple of things then in that case. If nobody's got their hand up. Oh, damn it.
One of the issues that we have is knowing from the start the longevity of the project, because when you kind of start out on a project, if you only think it's going to be a 6-month project, you're not going to engage with making sure it's all well documented from the start and well tested and stuff like that. Whereas if you work on it for 6 months and then someone says, right, this has got to work for the next 4 years, but you've got no more funding to make it any better, then yeah, you kind of get stuck in that situation. And I think a bit of that comes down to the gap between us writing the code and the funder and the PI that might sit in between. And they don't necessarily have any metrics to make sure that these outputs are achieving the standards that can ensure the longevity.
Yeah, I think I have heard that. And I think it just hit the nail on the head of that kind of point of people either being told you've got like 4 years and they feel like they have to make something, and actually it's kind of inappropriate and they realize halfway through this shouldn't be a product or it shouldn't be software, whatever. And then the other people who, yeah, like you say, have this brilliant idea and then they realize, hang on, this could be something, and then there's nowhere to go. But that gap with the PI as well is actually really interesting, because I think we often feel like, yeah, we're so reliant on that one person, and they're like always absolutely brilliant, to be very, very clear. But yeah, how are we either with the people that we have assessing and supporting on grants, or who we have on the ground, like connecting in with other staff as well is a really important point. Thank you. So I'm just furiously scribbling like notes. I'm also not going to ask when you say we who you are because it is being recorded, but I might ask you afterwards if that's okay. You don't have to tell me.
So personally, I've seen, I mean, there's obviously been a huge amount of change in this area over the last sort of, well, what, 14, 15 years. And what we were seeing at first is all these different like research practices that basically people have developed so that software can get written in a funding landscape that doesn't actually fit funding sustainable software very well. And and Wellcome are right there at the front. Actually, back in 2010, they were writing their first software policy, and we were helping with that at the time. And so, like, funders have this incredible ability. I mean, sometimes maybe it feels that funders don't move very quickly, but compared to the way the research culture and university moves, they are lightning fast, right? So you've got this incredible ability to sort of put pressure on universities in the right way. And the one thing I think that would help build sustainable software is caring about software as a research output. And that's why I think that is the main goal of the work that you were talking about. One of the things I think that could deliver the most. Because once we start worrying about the software as the thing that comes out of research rather than the results that go off and get published, then we start thinking more about sustainability, about costing it properly. People like research software engineers suddenly become assets to a research grant rather than an additional cost that you don't fully understand. And it starts to change the culture in the right way. So I think that focus on software as a research output is absolutely key.
I mean, I think that's kind of moving on to the next question, so I'll bring it up. But like, what does that look like for you guys? I mean, what, like, if you could have anything, if the grant or whatever it was designed for you. I mean, I'm not asking you to give me all of the answers, but yeah, intrigued to know how can we be better?
So I just had a wee nosy at your website, and an early career researcher is you will have recently completed a PhD. You don't need a PhD to be a research software engineer. So if you want to make your funding more accessible to us, that is excluding us or some of us straight away.
Just go back a couple of points that there was something about how you sort of design the software and knowing how long the funding is going to be for and how long you're thinking about it. And part of the problem I've found a few times is that if you design with the latest and greatest libraries that, feel like they solve everything, it tends to break really quickly as well. So there's a very good chance that if you write with the flashiest and possibly the easiest, that in 5 years' time, you'll be left with something that just doesn't work. And that maybe we need a bit more guidance and policy, possibly. I don't know if the fund is the right place for that to come from, or if it's more internal to RSE teams, but something that sets out that how to build software that lasts. And that often people's first reaction isn't to build software that lasts, especially when you've got 6 months to develop something.
I'm sorry, I think that's absolutely fair. And I just brought up the next. Oh, sorry. Go on. No, I was just going to say I just brought up the next question because I think we're kind of getting into it, which is just about the kind of actions of funders, but also thinking a bit about some of those metrics of software health. I think that was just a comment in the chat rather than a question.
Yeah, I was going to say I completely agree. Like, I think that something that funders can potentially do is to stop expecting novelty, because I think it's a way of, if you're writing a computational proposal, a way of making it seem novel to fit that criteria is to talk about, we're using this new technology and it's really exciting and all this kind of stuff. When in reality, using, as the comment said, boring stuff to do good, robust science, that the science is the novelty. But you can almost feel like you have your arm twisted behind your back to feel like you're innovating in everything when, we don't need to.
Getting back to this point about like the cross-cutting technology as well, funding them won't give you research outputs. Like, you won't get research papers out of the Jupyter Hub team because we are not researchers. We're also not attached to any university as well. So there needs to be a mechanism for giving money to a group of people who are not universities, basically. We have fiscal sponsors instead. So like, yeah, but like the amount of research that is being put out, that is being built on Jupyter hubs. Like I work for 2I2C and we run 3 separate hubs for 3 different departments at NASA. Like, yeah, it won't be a direct research output, but like it's a force multiplier for the research that is out in the world. Probably, yeah. The NASA OpenScapes sings our praises a lot. So like, I think 2ITC is still like working out what our credit system is as well, other than the money that lands in our bank account.
Yeah, I think it actually brings up the point that you made as well. Something that I find it's being recorded personally, I think Wellcome has been terrible at is supporting like non-traditional researchers, for want of a better phrase. And I think that this is something that we're finding we can be more flexible with in our particular work. So most of my work is in the African continent. Is we can be a bit more flexible with, because there's just a different expectation, or we're sort of saying, you know, oh, but people have been trained in these online courses and that's who we've got. And there just seems to be, I think, because they don't have these legacy systems of some of these institutions, a lot more fluidity and flexibility. Why we can't seem to translate that into our UK funding is a very big question. But my colleague Megan, who's also here, helps run those early career awards, and part of the big reason for her coming and being here is saying, well, like, how do we, particularly for our tools and tech stream, do things differently? I'm not saying that's, you know, oh, we've solved that or anything. I think that's a really valid point. And I think that what we find is that RSCs, where they're being funded, they're costed into these other bigger like lab grants, and they're not getting to lead themselves, and that's where a lot of that value is being lost. I'd definitely hear you on that.
Is it another point for the second part? And it's really difficult to get funding to maintain something that already exists. So we have an HPC, which is shared by 7 institutes across the UK. And we were very lucky to get more funding to replace the kit. And it's not money that we can put forward ourselves, because we're talking millions of pounds. We're not given any money to run that, other than from the other institutes. I don't know where they're getting the money from. And yeah, the kit is, you know, every few years needs to be replaced because it gets full or it gets slow, or yeah, things go wrong. And so and the same goes for software as well. It's not always about making the next thing. It's about maintaining something that is reliable and people use and benefit from. But getting rid of some bugs, or making it work with the next version of whatever it was written in, or rewriting it to not use those libraries that have just gone dead.
I was just about to ask you what you meant by maintenance. That's really cool.
So I take this over to Dave. I'll add another one. So one of the things we found with running an RSE group is that like scoping is hugely expensive, because you don't get that covered, because you've got a scope to put something into a bid, and then hopefully that gets rewarded and you write the software. So there's a real pressure on minimizing the amount of scoping you can do, because you're not getting that money back. So if there was a way of being able to apply for a fund that would give you enough time to actually scope a software project, so you could actually be more realistic about what was going to be achieved within the timeline and with that amount of money, that would be, I think that wouldn't take much money to do that, but it could be hugely influential on making sure that the sort of the well-scoped, well-thought-out software projects were the ones that got through to grant.
So just coming back really to that discussion of non-traditional roles, and particularly supporting the ecosystem of development. So there are some projects that would really benefit from non-traditional roles, but even extending beyond what you commonly see in research software engineering now. So like real user research, design research, user experience input, and then actual product managers that align more closely with what you see in industry, for example. So like as a key findings, it's really encouraging to see, you know, options being explored there. But I think that seeing the development of software almost as being completely separate from research in terms of a delivery of a product, but interfacing with research elements is would really help the kind of recognition of the development of software in research.
Yeah, that's really helpful. product management question is, we find that so frustrating. And I think, again, that's the point that comes sometimes in tension with those charitable aims and law, is this idea of like, but if you're creating a product, if it's going to be commercialized, what does that? And yeah, again, I'm not trying to make excuses, but I think it's a really, really interesting one. And I guess as a throwback to you guys in the room, and I suppose it goes for RSCs as well, I won't pretend to be an expert in their career progression either, but like, how much do you think these roles are people that should be like staff of an academic institution versus their own collaborative that get kind of pulled in as consultancy contract versus, I don't know, sitting in industry and they donate their skills for free? Again, I'm not asking anyone to like answer that right now, but these are the kind of things that we're thinking about. Sorry, I know you've got your hand up. I should stop talking. Oh, sorry. Stuart.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to maybe change this subject. So if you have a response, maybe we.
So Errol Bennett from the Alan Turing Institute, and we do have a team of people called research application managers who are inspired by product managers, but they are not the same as product managers, because their aims are not just to productize research outputs, but to do the work from helping people to get stuff into packages, thinking about user documentation, all the way through to things like, okay, we need to bring in external consultants around user experience design and things like that. They're in that liminal space between, oh, we've made this very cool thing, to actually getting it to stakeholders. That might not be like a formal product that is like licensed and commercialized. It might be a cool tool that local government use, or it might just be that they help researchers who have never produced a package before get something online and documented so that other people can use it down the line, or even just make sure that their GitHub repo is open and has some documentation so that 6 months later somebody can pick up that work. And we found them enormously useful. A lot of our researchers on the program where they were trialed, really like we can kind of credit them with helping the researchers get to the impact that they did get to. But we are still trying to figure out what they look like in terms of, you know, what you were saying about, are they collaborators? Are they, we want to support them as like permanent members of staff in similar way to like RSEs, where you're able to sort of buy them out to work on projects for different lengths of time, depending on how big the project is and things like that and the needs. But we've been trialing this. It's been really interesting to see that. And I think, I can put you in touch with people who'd like to talk more about it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds fantastic. And I actually should have given Turing some credit for some of the work we're doing, particularly in the African OpenAI platform. They've been hugely influential on that.
Stuart was going to talk, but did you have another follow-up point to that? Or is that all right, Stuart?
Sorry.
It's not just
It was just on that kind of the software as a product side, that particularly in something like citizen science, the software really does need to be industry standard, and the user accessibility and things like that, they all need to be considered. So having a product manager that's capable of delivering that, it's absolutely vital to the research itself. It's not just about something that can ultimately be commercial.
You know, you say industry standards, and then you use something like Microsoft Teams and think, oh, it's not.
So thinking about like what funders can do, something that I would find incredibly helpful would be to change the way that accounting is done. So the fact that you often in grants, there's money that you can spend on salary and there's money you can spend on stuff. And it's very hard to move money between those two categories. So just as an example, me and some colleagues won a grant of like 350K, ostensibly to buy a new UAV system to fly a big LiDAR drone. And we had two options. We could buy an insanely kitted out drone that was more than we would ever need and more than we will ever need for 350K, or we could get something that would meet our needs for 200K, with the aim of then spending the rest of that money on staff for, you know, like a 3-year, you know, RSE or 2 and a bit year, I guess, would have been RSE to help develop the software to analyze the data that it collects. And we were told by our institution, absolutely not. Spend 350 grand or lose 150 grand. So we're now in a position where we barely fly one of the most expensive drones in the UK because we have so much data and no one to, it's basically like I have to write the code in between lectures and emails and stress. So just treating us like adults effectively, where, like we can look at a budget and actually spend, because fundamentally like software is people. So we can't, you can't say like, okay, we're going to budget 20 grand and we're going to buy 20 grand worth of software. Yeah. You need, you need to pay someone to write that.
No, that's really helpful. I mean, I've only been at Welcome for like just over a year, and yeah, some of the stuff that we're not allowed to do, and actually this PhD student has to do this thing as well, and this money honestly still baffles me. I think it's a very complex space. But yeah, I think we tried to do different ways of funding. So like Welcome, for example, last summer had this thing called the Ideathon, which was supposed to be about getting in non-Russell Group universities. In the end, we weren't really allowed to do that, so we had to make it open application. But the idea was being is that we get people, in earlier. They could come from different places. We could be more flexible with that funding. And I think trying to slowly push that dial, but having case studies such as yourself is really helpful. Where you not in a rude way, you feel like money's being wasted because it can't be shifted around. I guess the question for you guys would be then like, did you know when you were applying that that's how it was going to be, or was it one of those where like it was just given and it had to be spent in a certain way? I'm just interested of like where in that process like the change could have come.
So this was so it was NERC capital funding delivered to our institution that then had an internal institutional bun fight over who would then spend the money.
I'm with you.
So I assume there was NERC reporting, but my institution has lots of money. They say they don't, but they do. So the fact that they couldn't, have shuffled things around in order to facilitate good science and good research happening is incredibly frustrating.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Yeah.
I think I've had the same thing happen many times where money has been misappropriated into the wrong thing, but often the cause has been because it's been much easier to apply for equipment funding than it has been for people, to the point where I had one grant where we were told the minimum bid was 250K. We wanted something that was about 50K. So we made up things basically to spend another 200K and bought a load of equipment that never got used because there was never any people to do anything with it. On the plus side, we actually bought a load of consumables and things that were actually quite useful and lasted many years after the end of it, but that was probably 10K's worth.
Yeah.
And if we could have spent half of that money on people, we could have done so much more with what we got.
It's really interesting.
Just a question for you then, Colin. Would like more like equipment only smaller funds have helped with that problem?
We wouldn't have wasted money in that case. So we would have spent the 50K and not bothered spending 200K on things we didn't really need.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's scope for like these smaller funds or for like more specific equipment and things like that as well.
That money was really easy to apply for. Another situation, I got given 150,000 to buy some equipment based on one paragraph of text that someone else had submitted a grant application for 3 years earlier and had been recycled. I didn't even know this had been applied for, and someone says, here you go spend this money. But then I had to find the time to do all the tenders and everything else, and it actually took a lot of my time to get that stuff bought. And that often doesn't get considered either.
That's a really interesting point. I had definitely hadn't thought of that. Yeah, and it's interesting that kind of minimum amount of money, and I think it's because certainly for us, like getting a grant out the door, whether it's 10K or, well, not 10 million actually, because once you get to that kind of scale of money, things are very complicated, but 100K or 100,000, like it's basically the same. And I think there can often be some quite internal resistance to, yeah. So I think it's quite interesting, but equally, yeah, I think then showing some of that waste is, yeah, because arguably we could just hire in a bunch more, grant staff, that difference in funding. But anyway, cool.
Should I just say we've got 5 minutes left? So, if I believe, yeah, 5 minutes left.
Any other like kind of questions for me on next step? I appreciate. So I talk quite quickly anyway, especially when I'm nervous, and also I'm like really hot and to like my kind of very first slide on like what we're actually doing. And if there's yeah, I mean, fair. I'm happy to hear on that. I think some of it's kind of like coming through a little bit, but yeah, really happy to take any specifics on that.
So all this work with, how to measure non-traditional outputs and like roles that are hidden and stuff. I mean, it would be really helpful if there was a sort of national campaign running that maybe Welcome could get behind. So we're going to be working on software as one of those outputs. So certainly and that will all be open licensed and available. So we'd be more than interested to talk to you about that.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, and this is not to me use parental leave as an excuse, to be very clear, but I think part of the reason why I've been like really pushing over the last kind of like 4 to 6 weeks, and then for my next kind of like 6 weeks to get all this findings option appraisal, and then hopefully the person that comes in to cover for me, who, if it's who I hope they are, will be definitely well able for this and comes from exactly the right background. But they'll then start to help think about some of those implementation routes. I think we've got colleagues going to RSCCon in September, and hopefully we'll be able to do a different iteration of this kind of workshop to say, here's actually what we think we're going to do, and get feedback on it rather than just the early stage findings. But I know someone called us lightning fast earlier with all these things. They'll be a bit slower, and I'm sure there'll be like little tweaks and changes to some of our policies that you may or may not notice. I think other big funding calls that we'd like to do, so something like a big open source funding call, that would be fantastic, but actually doing that is a huge amount of work. We're only actually allowed to do so many per year in the organization. Whether or not we collaborate with someone, like there's kind of all these moving parts, but really happy to kind of keep having a very live conversation. And anyone who wants to be interviewed, it won't be by myself. We have an external expert doing that, so people can speak like really freely and openly and not worry that, I don't know, Welcome's going to hate them afterwards or anything dramatic like that. Can definitely put you on that list and send you like a link to book in. Or if anyone just wants to have a follow-up chat, we can definitely put you in touch with myself or my parental leave cover in a few weeks. But any final reflections or questions, really, really welcome.
I could add another one. I can always add things. So one of the other things I would like to say is that, and I say this to all the funders, like basically you can put in policies into place, but actually getting research organizations to follow those policies is an entirely different subject. So, a lot of these things have come through to support software, non-traditional roles. They're sort of, the funder puts it into place and, we'll advertise it and it goes out, but it actually takes a bit of hammering to get it through into the research organizations that they realize, it's okay to put an RSE on a grant, or it's okay to have software as an output and things like that. So there's an angle of getting the message through to research organizations.
On the metrics front, that sort of traditional metrics of software quality, like what your test coverage is like, is it version controlled, is it well documented, have you got maybe a containerized version of it at the end? All those sort of things would be really nice to encourage, and often aren't by funders, and actually short deadlines to do as much research impact as possible actually work against those things sometimes, because you don't spend the time building quality software. You maximize trying to get a single graph for a paper.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I think I'd love to be in a world where every project was required 100% test coverage, but I'd actually argue potentially against that being a metric, and the metric to instead to take the software development mantra that actually the metric should be more high level on something that you must be able to run that software in 5 years' time. So regardless of what processes or steps you take to do that, that's the metric.
Oh, that's really interesting. I really like that.
Standard approach would be 4 years, 364 days later, you get a PhD student to work on things. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're just about at time, but if anyone has one last thing we can catch me afterwards. And my colleague Hannah, who's our open science lead, and Megan from Discovery Research, who runs our tools and tech stream, are all here all evening and tomorrow. So just catch us at any point too.
Just a final comment to say that I think it's really great that funders are like actually coming to these events, engaging and asking questions like, what do you actually need? So that's a really positive thing. Thank you.
Well, I really do hope it can become a positive change. And I promise there's at least a small group of us really hammering away to try and make something happen. Well, and thank you to everyone online. I'll put my email in the chat in case anyone wants to follow up because I appreciate it's hard to do things remotely.